very first lesson is in appraising is cost does not equal value.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard thing for people to kind of grasp sometimes because they know they spent $3 million.
Yes.
But the appraiser comes along and it's not worth that much, then they understand we have a hard time with that.
Yeah. This is Lived In, a podcast by Hemby Home Company in association with Haystack Realty Group in Greenville, North Carolina. Lived In exists to host thought-provoking discussions on design and real estate, empowering everyday home dwellers to live beautifully regardless of budget or circumstance. Every 2 weeks, join me, your host Femi Koz, a realtor, design advisor and content manager, as we cover everything from how to effectively conduct a home search to which rooms are worth the investment in your home. Together, let's find out what it really takes to live beautifully. This season, we're hosting interviews with experts, putting the keys in your hand as you make some of the most important decisions that come with creating a beautiful place to live. Well, how much is your house worth? How can you be sure? And what updates should you make in the name of adding value? This week's guests are Ashley Barker and Hannah Martin from Appraisal Advantage, and Ashley and Hannah are sharing their knowledge as appraisers to help you maximize house value, invest where it counts, and avoid costly mistakes. If you want to know if pools add value, whether marble or granite will get you a larger return, or why it makes a difference whether you're renovating or updating, then this is a conversation you don't want to miss. This special episode was recorded at the offices of Haystack Realty Group in Greenville in front of a live crowd, so sit back, relax, and listen in. Let's get into it. Well, Ashley and Hannah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I am very excited to just share with the audience, the listeners, the insights that both of you have that most people don't have, most homeowners don't have. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into it and start asking questions.
Okay, that'll be
Does that
fine.
sound good?
Sure.
Sounds great.
Sure.
The most amenable people you'll ever meet. How did you get into this field? How did you start?
Well, my father was a real estate appraiser, and I got into it back in 1987, 37 years ago. It's hard to believe. But back then, it was kind of difficult to become an appraiser. You almost had to know someone that was an appraiser, and even a lot of times it was a family member. So that's how I got into business. It's changed a lot since then to where people like Hannah can get into the business and by a different route. But that's how I was introduced to it. The little anecdote that I like to tell people is back when I first got into appraising, when I would tell people, they say, "What do you do?" I'd say, "I'm a real estate appraiser." Almost to a person, they would say, "Whoa, wow, what is that? That's interesting." And now almost to a person, they say, "Well, do you know this person or do you know that person?"
Yeah.
So I know there's more of us out there.
Yes.
So, Hannah, anything to add?
Yeah, I started working in the office with Ashley in October of 2021 when he was really busy and just needed help with workflow. And at that same time, a former trainee of his had gone off on his own and the slot was open. And one day he was like, "I was just wondering if you were interested in being a trainee. I've kind of held this spot open for you." And Ashley several times a year gets people calling or emailing asking to be a trainee, so I knew it was something that could be worthwhile, even though I wasn't as familiar with the industry at that time. So I just started going with him on inspections and started writing up reports and realized I really liked it. And then in January of this year I finally got certified.
Hey! We're at the office, so you're going to hear all the voices. That's amazing. So okay, so you finally got certified, but you could do most of the other functions before you got certified.
I was pretty much doing it, but that's like I have my official license by the state of North Carolina.
Yes.
You have to take a bunch of classes, have experience hours with a supervisor, and take a state exam.
Okay, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So obviously Ashley's been doing it longer than you have. So Ashley, how long have you been doing it? Because you also were a realtor at a certain point.
Well, a realtor for a very brief period of time several years ago.
Yes.
I've been appraising 37 years, but I was active with the state Realtor Association, and they put me on the forms committee. And when I attended my first forms committee meeting, I realized I really didn't know what went into writing up a contract. You know, I looked at them all the time for appraisals, but I decided that it would be beneficial for me as a state representative to know what that side of the business was all
Right.
about. And I had my broker's license since I think 1987, so it had just been sort of inactive, or it was active but not being utilized, and so I dusted it off and did some brokerage, and I really enjoyed it. I mainly was working as a buyer's agent, and I enjoyed that side of the business.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if someone's listening, they don't know what an appraiser is, they've never bought a house before, they've never sold a house before, can you explain what the purpose of an appraisal is, what an appraisal is, and then what its purpose is?
Well, the majority of the appraisals that we do are for mortgage financing.
Yep.
So when someone purchases a home or refinances or goes for a home equity line, then the lender will typically want a collateral check, so to speak. So they'll order an appraisal, and we'll go out and look at the property and render an opinion of value of what we think the home would sell for on that day we were there. That's really what the appraised value is.
Are there any other useful purposes or other uses beyond
Sure.
that?
We do quite a few for estate purposes. I do work for a lot of the attorneys in town for mostly what's called equitable distribution or divorce cases. So if the parties can't agree on the value, they'll have appraisals done in order to try to come up with a reconciliation.
Yeah.
But I'd say mortgage lending accounts for probably 90% of our work volume.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And it fluctuates based on how the market is and how the interest rates are.
Yes. So right now, how busy are you?
We're moderately busy. Not as busy as we were during the pandemic when interest rates were at 3%.
Right. I'm sure it was insanity.
We were at 5-6 week turnaround.
Wow.
Where now we're more like a week.
Yes.
Is what the standard is in the industry.
Yeah. So what exactly are you doing at a property when you go to do an appraisal? When you show up, what are you doing there?
Well, after we introduce ourselves to the homeowners, if they're home,
Yeah.
just a lot of times if it's a purchase, it's a vacant property, but we typically start on the outside of the home, measuring the exterior of the home. That's how the square footage is calculated. Taking notes about the exterior materials and condition, taking photographs of the exterior, and then work our way inside to pretty much do the same thing on the interior. We don't do any interior measurements. A lot of people are surprised by that. When we get inside the home, they're waiting for us to measure every room, but as I say, the square footage is calculated from the exterior. So we walk through the interior, drawing a floor plan, making notes about the materials and the condition, then we have to take photographs of everything.
Yeah.
And that list has gotten longer.
Okay.
Prior to the foreclosures that occurred in 2008, 2013 period, we didn't even take interior photographs.
Oh, wow.
And the lenders at that time decided that they may have been making loans on properties they didn't really know enough about. So that's when it shifted. And there were some surprised people for a while there that were like, well, the last time we had it, they didn't have to take pictures of the bathroom.
Yeah.
So and typically an appraisal, depending on the size of the home, the inspection portion of it will take 30 minutes to an hour. Okay.
And then you go back and do the more extensive part.
Correct.
Which is what?
Well, it's really analysis of the property and the market, and as I call it, the appraisal report's 20 pages long, typically with photographs and maps. But what I call the meat and potatoes is actually that there's a grid where you list the features of the subject property as the home you're appraising is known, and then so you select sales comparables or properties that have been on the market that have sold recently that are similar to your subject property. And a good comparable is a property that would be a reasonable alternative to a prospective purchaser of the subject.
Right.
Okay, it needs to be something that the same buyer would have considered. So once you select those comparables, you list them on that grid and you make adjustments to them. And that's one of 3 approaches to value that's on a standard appraisal, but it's known as the sales comparison analysis, but it is the most important.
Yes.
Because the appraisal process is based on the theory of substitution. And so the lenders kind of want to know, if we're going to lend money on this, show us what other homes have sold for.
Yeah.
Because the basis of it is really in the collateral check is the lender saying, if we happen to own this one day, unfortunately, how much can we sell it for? So that's the whole reason why they have an appraisal done.
So when you're selecting comps, how much of a factor is age?
Hannah, why don't you answer that?
Well, if it's new construction,
Yes.
ideally you want to use newly constructed comparables. And I don't know, when we do a search, maybe it's within like 10 years. But when you get into stuff like maybe a 100-year-old house
Yes.
that's been remodeled throughout, you've essentially lowered the effective age of the home and it's how old it seems.
Yes.
And you've decreased the overall level of depreciation in the home. So with that, sometimes I'll even take away the age variable in my comparable search and look at location, size, finishes, that sort of thing. Because when you get into extensive remodeling, the actual age I feel like is less important of a variable compared to your subject. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, new construction, as Hannah said, that's kind of its own little segment of the market, so to speak, because not all buyers are interested in new construction, and a lot of buyers, that's all they really want.
Yes.
So if we're doing a home that's newly constructed, we'll have new homes on there, but we may, in fact, sometimes the lender wants a resale, just to kind of, and they typically will want some comparables that are outside of the builder's control that built the subject property.
Right.
Because historically, I guess there's been instances where a builder kind of has their own pricing that doesn't match up with anything around it.
Yes.
And so the lender wants to kind of be on guard for that.
To show market acceptance of that development. And like Ashley said, that like one in the development, one out, Fannie Mae has a comparable sales guide, and they have specific requirements for new construction or recently developed subdivisions, and they tend to be defined as recently developed if like the builder is still involved with the transactions or the original developer. So like Ashley said, it's usually one in that subdivision, one outside of it for market acceptance, and then the third can be from inside or outside, but they prefer a resale. So ideally you have a resale in the subdivision to show that like even more acceptance of that when the builder's not involved in the pricing of it. So that might be something where you're like, there's 3 of the same floor plan, they're all brand new. Why weren't those used as comps 1, 2, and 3? That's why, because they want that variety when they're being sent to Fannie Mae.
Yes, that makes sense.
And I'll add that since Hannah brought up Fannie Mae, that stands for the Federal National Mortgage Association, and they are a quasi-governmental agency, as it's described, that pretty much sets the rules for the lending industry. And any appraisal that we do typically for a lender has to meet Fannie Mae guidelines, and that makes it sellable on the secondary market.
Yes.
Lenders will package loans and sell them, and every loan in that package has to meet Fannie Mae guidelines in order for it to be marketable on the secondary market. So they pretty much make the rules that we have to follow.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that there's regulation.
Oh, absolutely. Regulation we have plenty of.
Yeah. Probably too much. This isn't something we've talked about before, but I want to know how much of a factor condition is. So if something is in a poor condition, how do you account for that in your kind of analysis?
Condition is very important. As I tell folks, appraisers are human beings, so when we inspect a property, the condition of the home matters.
Yes.
One of the changes to the appraisal form as a result of all the foreclosures that I mentioned earlier is we now have some abbreviations that we use for certain things, and condition is one of those. We have to rate the property from a C1 to a C6, with C1 being brand new. C6 being not habitable. And a Fannie Mae lender will not make a loan on a property that has a C5 or a C6 condition. So we don't see many of those actually, thankfully. C4 is kind of average, where C3 would be good, C2 very good, and C1 excellent. If you could put those abbreviations to to English words that we used to use on appraisals.
Yes. Well, so then what would so C6 not habitable? What would that property look like? Like, what does that need to look like?
Like you can kind of imagine. We'll occasionally, it's rare, but sometimes we'll have an assignment where we go look at it and it's just not, it's not going to meet the standard. And a lot of times we'll just notify the lender of that, and they probably cancel the deal, just so we don't put the borrowers through the expense of a full appraisal.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so then condition is a factor,
It is.
age is a factor to a certain extent,
Yes.
depending on if the house has been, I guess the impact of age is
Well,
varies.
it's kind of like the age and condition kind of commingle again in that overall depreciation of
Okay.
the property. Right.
Correct.
Yeah. So I don't know.
No, that's
Yeah.
a good answer.
Yeah.
She referenced effective age earlier, and that's an
Yes.
important point.
Mhm.
As I tell folks, every home has an actual age, but more importantly for appraisal purposes is its effective age, which is
Right.
how, as Hannah said, it's how old does the home seem.
Mhm.
So a 20-year-old home that's had updates and been maintained well can sometimes come off as 10, 12 years old.
Right.
Or it can be, every bit of 20.
Mhm.
We very rarely do appraisals where the effective age is greater than the actual age, because
Okay.
that would be getting into probably a conditional
condition issue, yeah, that
Exactly.
makes sense.
Yeah.
So other factors I know you consider are square footage, geography or location. How do those influence value?
Well, going to location, the old adage in real estate, location, location, location.
Yes.
That is very true and important. Where the property is located. That's why it's important for appraisers to select comparables from the same location if
Mhm.
possible. Whenever we're doing an appraisal in a subdivision, if we can find sales in that subdivision, then you kind of remove the location question. But there are differences in location, as
Yeah.
we all know, from one property to the other. And a lot of it, if it's moving towards a neutral or negative location, a lot of times it has what we call external obsolescence, which is a fancy word for there's something outside of the control of the homeowner that is negatively affecting
Mhm.
their value. And the quintessential example might be the salvage yard right across the street.
Right.
You don't own that, you can't do anything about it, but it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Or more commonly is a property that's located on a heavily traveled road.
Mhm.
So those are locational factors that we have to take into consideration. I think gross or square footage you mentioned
Yes.
too. That looking at sales data, we have been able to develop what kind of an adjustment will apply for square footage difference. And people are quite surprised often that it's not representative. Let's just use a round number. Back in the day before the market, prices went up, people would talk in terms of $100 a square foot.
Mhm.
Well, the adjustment for square footage or gross living area, as we call it on the appraisal, is less than that, because that $100 a foot is inclusive of everything.
Right.
The land, the garage, the decks, anything that's separate from just the gross living area.
Mhm.
So the typical adjustment on something like that might be $30, $35 a square
Oh,
foot.
wow.
So less than people would expect, but it's we've developed that from analysis of market data.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything to add there, Hannah?
No, but just that, like Ashley mentioned, that square footage adjustment, it's exclusively for that change in square footage. And like you said, when you're looking at, well, this house sold for so and so per square foot, it's all inclusive of the property, additional acreage or detached buildings,
Mhm.
pools, all of that's included in that sold price per square foot. So when we're making that adjustment for just gross living area, it's just for
Just
that
the
gross
living
living
area,
area. Yeah.
It's funny because you mentioned two things I was thinking about.
Yeah.
One of them is pools.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss, our broker in charge at Haystack, is in the room and she has opinions on pools, but she's not going to speak.
Okay.
You will not hear her voice because she doesn't like to talk on these. But she has opinions on pools. Do pools add value? Is it sometimes yes and sometimes no? Is it never? Is it always?
I've never given a negative adjustment for a pool. There are some people out there that would say pools are just health hazards and you got to fill them in. We don't look at it that way.
Yeah.
The pool, a lot of it depends on where the home is located and how typical it is for the homes in that area to have a pool.
Okay.
So if you're in a neighborhood where there's not many pools and and pool installation, like a lot of things, has gotten more expensive over the last many years. And so it's not uncommon. We've just completed a couple of assignments where the pools were probably $50,000 or $60,000.
Yeah.
And the typical adjustment for a pool in a typical location is probably more like $10,000 to $20,000. In an atypical location, the appraiser may choose to give it $5,000, or they may choose, if they develop that opinion from their analysis, to not give it any value.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen very often, though, I don't think, practically.
And I think the only time that I've seen that done on a report was where the condition of the pool was where it wasn't even usable.
Yes.
Right. So would someone pay you extra for this pool where the pump doesn't work, it hasn't been well maintained, the liner's torn up? Probably not.
Yeah.
Right. So
Correct.
just in that scenario.
Yep.
No, that makes sense.
But pools overall, they do add value, I believe. But there's different levels of pools, as you know.
Yes.
The two I was just referencing were very custom. They weren't just rectangular
Right.
holes in the ground. They were, curved sides all around and just almost lagoon looking.
Yes.
And I think recently we did an appraisal and we had put up $25,000 on the pool. So that's about as high as we'll go on
Yeah.
the pool.
Wow.
Yeah. But that was a home that was nearly $1 million. So it's all kind of relative.
So then, does landscaping impact the appraisal?
That's
fine, you guys
That's a
have
good question. It impacts the appraisal only to the level I was speaking to earlier, where appraisers are human. We go there and if it's really nicely landscaped, but I learned a long time ago, you don't put landscaping on the appraisal as an adjustment item. Lenders don't want to make a 15 or 30-year loan on shrubbery.
Right.
So that has to be maintained constantly or
Right.
yearly in order to keep its appearance up. So they're looking mainly for long-term items. And so there's ways to kind of factor it in. Sometimes we do these homes, that are just large and valuable, and they have tens of thousands of dollars worth of landscaping. And we might lump it all together under an adjustment of site improvements. Because they are improvements to the site.
Right.
But a lot of times you need to have what we call hardscaping involved there, where there's actually retaining walls
Yes.
or borders around the beds. That enhances the value of it. But never do we make a line item adjustment for landscape.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's very
Yeah.
good to know.
Yep.
And then one more question before we get into practicals for listeners a bit more. How do you factor in acreage? I haven't done many listings that have a lot that's maybe greater than an acre, but the house that is, let's say 3 bedrooms, 1,600 square feet on an acre versus the house that is 3 bedrooms, same size on 0.28 of an acre.
Right.
How does the land factor in?
Well, land that's larger than the site that the home is built on is usually classified in 2 categories, either surplus or excess land.
Okay.
If it's surplus land, it can't be separated out from the remainder of the lot,
Okay.
and it just adds value to, you just have a bigger site, so to
Yes.
speak. If it's excess land, it could actually be sold separately.
Okay.
And that's when you get into, a good example would be a property that's selling, as we see sometimes where they say, adjacent lot available, where they'll try to sell the lot next to it. We've done appraisals like that, and that separate lot has value of its own. It can, very easily be sold as a separate lot.
Right.
So it would be valued at a higher level than if it were deemed surplus land.
That makes sense.
Yes.
And is that based on size then, but whether it's surplus versus excess, or is it?
No, it's based on the zoning and actually, if it, a lot of times we'll see larger tracts of land, and they're usually properties that have septic systems, and they need larger areas to be able to put the septic system in, and basically the other portion of the lot wouldn't perk, as we call it. It wouldn't be suitable for a septic system.
Right.
Plus, if it's in a subdivision that's already been platted, it just happens to be one of the big lots in the back in the cul-de-sac, you can't subdivide that. So it is just simply surplus land that has value. If you literally, any of these adjustments we're talking about, the simplest way to think about it is if you have 2 properties that are identical, except for that one feature.
Right.
So if you've got one property that's on 3/4 of an acre and you've got one that's on 1/4 of an acre, it only makes common sense that someone's going to pay you more for the 3/4 of an acre. The question gets to be how much more.
Yeah.
It may only be $5,000 depending on what your analysis tells you, but it could be greater than that.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
that makes sense.
Anything to add there, Hannah? I know that's kind of a complicated question.
No, yeah, I wrote
Okay.
like excess or surplus land in my
Okay.
question
Yes.
notes, and like Ashley said, with excess land, the big thing is land that it can be separated out from the primary parcel, and it doesn't what is it like? It's not necessary for like its function,
Right.
and we've done some where it's two parcels, and it's like the parcel with the primary improvement, the dwelling, and then a little sliver next to it that's 0.1 acre.
Right.
So that's surplus, right?
Right.
It's not necessary to serve the primary improvement, but it was just kind of lumped in because that's how the neighborhood was platted out. And with that excess land, like Ashley said, it can be sold separately, and you're looking at like, is it buildable? Does it perk? Like for how much contributory value it would have.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
sums it up good. But the most extreme example was an appraisal that Hannah did within the last 6 months in one of our larger developments in town, and it literally had an adjacent lot that went along with it, and I think the value of that lot was $350,000, if I remember correct. The house was selling over $1 million,
Yeah.
but it came with this lot over
Yes.
there. So we had to include it on the appraisal. It was in the contract, written up that way, and it sometimes can make for a difficult appraisal because the lender typically, there's a concept in appraising that's come about in the last few years known as bracketing,
Okay.
where any feature of the subject property, the property we're appraising, the lenders want that feature to be bracketed. Meaning they want, if it's gross living area or square footage, they want one that's about the same, one that's bigger, and one that's smaller. So you're sort of coming at it from all directions.
Right.
As compared to all the comparables are smaller and they have to be adjusted upwards.
Yes.
There's nothing that makes a lender more nervous than across the board positive adjustments on the comparables. Because they haven't really seen evidence that what you're saying the home is
Right.
is there.
That makes
So,
sense.
yeah.
Lived In is brought to you by Haystack Realty Group. Buying and selling homes always comes at a cost, but why make it bigger than it needs to be? At Haystack Realty Group, we work with you to protect your assets so that whether you're buying or selling, you always maximize the amount left in your pocket. If you're thinking about buying property and want some help, or if you'd like to know how much your land or property is worth, click the links in our show notes or go to www.haystackre.com. That's www.haystackre.com. So then moving inside of the house, which I think listeners are going to be more interested in than land. But I find this fascinating, and I think it's helpful for people selling land. But something I think people are going to ask is, are materials a factor? And you did mention them earlier, so I know that they are a factor to an extent, but are you going through saying, oh, this is marble, so it's worth more, or versus, oh, it's a Formica countertop?
It's more of a cumulative thing. We don't make an adjustment for quartz versus granite countertops. It's just the appraisal process is not that precise, as I tell people. But just as I mentioned earlier about condition abbreviations, they also have abbreviations for quality.
Okay.
And they also go from Q1 to Q6. Q1, by definition, is a custom home with architectural plans that has the best of the best in it. There again, you get up to Q5 and Q6, and you're really in territory that lenders aren't comfortable making loans with. So we have to make a determination when we're there of what we believe the quality level of the home is.
Right.
So most properties fall in a Q4, which would be either again like average, or Q3. Q2 you don't see very often because it's kind of in no man's land really. It's kind of between Q3 and Q1. But when you do a home that's Q1, you know it. It's just one of those you walk into, you're like, this special place.
Yes.
So so the materials, they make a difference, but as I say, in a more of a cumulative way than individually.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you think about the appraisal, the meat and potatoes section of the appraisal, there's only about 15 lines that we make adjustments for. So it doesn't get, and it's the way the form is designed, it goes from the most significant down to the least significant.
And then are they weighted?
Well, no, not against one another.
Okay.
They're just You just, like one of the very first, as we talked about earlier, the very first thing is location. So, yeah, if you're doing a property that's a superior location, the appraiser will, if the comparable is superior, then you have to take away some value from that comparable. You're trying to make the comparables more similar to the subject.
Right.
So that each of the comparables at the bottom of their column has an indicated value after adjustments. And that's really what you're looking at if you're trying to assess an appraisal.
Yes.
How tight are those numbers down there? And but you start with location, and at the bottom there's actually 2 or 3 blank spaces where you can fill in stuff like fenced yard or detached storage building. So those are the things, and so the form is not designed for the appraiser to get into the weeds, so to speak, where you say granite versus marble.
Right.
You can't measure that. And that's an important point, because anything that we do as far as adjustments, we need to be able to show our work if asked.
Yes.
Okay.
Hannah, anything you would add?
With when Ashley was talking about the definitions and ratings, like
Yes.
the C's and the Q's, something I did want to mention is that's part of the Uniform Appraisal Data Set. Definitions, again, given to us by Fannie Mae, and that's something that's attached to all our reports that are done for mortgage lending purposes, and they're available online if listeners wanted to read through the specifics of those definitions. That's what I've had pulled up in front of me, but I feel like it's not super fun and exciting to listen to me read through definitions.
I get that.
Yeah, but that is something that people could go look to if they wanted to kind of see more specifics of how those are differentiated amongst each other.
And what did you say it's called?
It's the Uniform Appraisal Data Set Definitions Addendum.
Okay.
People refer to it as UAD.
Okay. I've got it. I will make sure I include a link in the show notes.
Okay.
Okay, so then we're frequently told, I understand not being able to weigh certain materials against one another, but if you watch, and I know we've talked about this before when you guys have been here, if you watch an HGTV show or any other show that's about a house, they'll say, yeah, they updated the bathroom, that adds value. So I would love for you guys to explain what actually does boost the value and by how much.
Well, one thing I think that's important to point out to you listeners is when I mentioned that the appraisal form had been updated and where now we do interior photographs, they also included a section that asks specifically if there are updates to the kitchen and or the bathrooms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, on the appraisal report. And they want to know when those updates occurred, less than a year ago, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, or 11 to 15 years ago. So anything beyond 15 years, you don't have to check a box.
Yeah.
So whenever we're doing an appraisal where the homeowner's present, we'll ask them if we can tell that it's evident they've done some updating to the kitchen or bathrooms when they did it, so we can check the appropriate box. But those are definitely the 2 areas, obviously, that Fannie Mae thought were most important in a home.
Yes.
And that's where you get, as I say, the most bang for your buck, you know. And so, I think working with buyers, that makes a big difference on them when they walk in and the kitchen's been updated. If it's done in a way that's market accepted, we see some updates that are so custom that you're like, I don't know if you've helped yourself or not.
I want you to give examples. Get spicy, Ashley.
Well, I mean, countertops, they're a particular color. We don't see color so much, with hard surfaces anymore, but we've done homes recently where there were purplish countertops in there that were like a solid surface. And the homeowner was proud of them, but that's the kind of thing that would probably have an adverse reaction to your typical buyer. So as I tell folks, if they ask ahead of time, if you're making improvements to your home, don't make it too custom. Do it like what you think the typical buyer would like. You can add some spice to it, but don't get too carried away.
Yes.
If you do it with like paint color on the wall, something that can be changed. But add your flair there versus something that's just going to be more expensive to do. Hannah, what else you want to say about
I was
that?
just thinking about paint while you were talking.
Okay.
Like that's one of those that you walk into a house and there's a red kitchen and a green bedroom. You know, that's something where you walk in and you go, oh, green kitchen
Yes.
or whatever it is, neon green. I know sometimes before houses go to market, like they'll just paint the house agreeable gray, right? Like something that could suit everyone's palette.
Yes.
I feel like that could be like a good example of like you're just meeting market trends kind of thing, and nothing that's too custom,
Yes.
like the neon green kitchen.
So I would like to know, you said if you're there and the homeowner's there and you walk in and you can tell it's been updated, what counts as updated? Like if it's the original cabinets in a 1960s house but they painted them, does that add value?
It's up to the appraiser, I think, to make that determination, because the question where I mentioned the kitchen and the bathroom updating, it wants you to differentiate between updating and renovations.
Okay.
And the difference there is renovations involve taking out walls or moving walls.
Okay.
Updating is just changing the surfaces that are
Yes.
present already. So, you know, and we probably, if a homeowner has gone to the trouble to paint their cabinets, it probably is something that we would mark as being updated. But typically that goes along with new countertops. Appliances, not so much. You know, one thing that I have to explain to people sometimes is that we don't even include the refrigerator on an appraisal. And that's because we have to look at what's market accepted as far as what usually transfers with the property.
Right.
And a refrigerator is not permanently affixed, and so it can leave overnight. But the same can be said of a stove or a range.
Right.
But ranges are typically included on an appraisal because it's market accepted.
Right.
That as a seller, you're going to leave that behind. So, but if all they've done is just put in stainless steel appliances, that may not meet the level of updating the kitchen, because I think the intent is really changing the surfaces.
Right.
The flooring or the countertops, adding that backsplash. Those type things, and you can tell almost immediately when you walk into a home. We know how old it is from the tax records and just having done some previous research. But if you go in and the kitchen looks 5 years old and the home's 25 years old, then you start asking when they did the updates.
So it's interesting, this this point of distinction between a wall being moved versus not. That really is the bottom line, is if you moved a wall.
It is.
That's so interesting. So you could, because I'm thinking in a bathroom where everything is in there and obviously conveys with the house, if someone replaces the tub, the sink, the toilet, that's still an update, that's not a renovation.
Correct.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
You heard it here
I mean,
first.
that's the strictest definition of it, where, you know, folks commonly might just say, I've renovated my bathroom, you know, but Fannie Mae's intent is for when you've actually changed the configuration of the room.
So then I'm assuming based on that the renovation carries more additional value for the appraisal.
Well, it usually is done for a reason.
Yes.
You know, homes that were built in our area in the 60s and 70s, a lot of times they'll have a kitchen with a bar that hangs out and cabinets, you know, that hang down. And everyone, you know, I think I've heard the trend is reversing to where people are going away from open floor plans that we've heard about for years. But everybody kind of wants to open it up so you can see, and it makes sense, because that does date a home if you go in and it hasn't been renovated or the cabinets haven't been, you know, switched.
Yes. So then if I updated my bathroom or my kitchen, how does that affect the value?
Well, two ways.
Yes.
Most importantly, it lowers the effective age that we were talking about earlier. But you can also make a quality improvement if you go with finishes. But I have to stress that you have to, when you make improvements to your home, you want to stay within what's normal for the neighborhood.
Yes.
Because you can over-improve a home. You always hear of over-improvement, you think the house is just too big. Well, you can over-improve it in terms of quality too. If you're in a neighborhood where, of course, granite, you're seeing granite in just about everything these days, so that's no longer the great example. But you know, if somebody goes in and they put, you know, marble tile flooring in and columns and just really customize it, it may not be as valuable there as it would be in a neighborhood where it's kind of common.
Yeah.
So that's how it can really impact the value. I think most importantly by reducing the effective age, and that's they've tried to remove all the subjectivity from an appraisal. they really would like, I think, the powers that be to be able to do appraisals with a computer. As a profession, we thought that the sky was falling when the internet came out. So we're still here, you know, and so that I think they still, in a lot of instances, want what we call boots on the ground. You know, somebody actually going in the home, because you guys know as real estate brokers, you know, you can't tell everything from a home about the exterior. You really can't.
Are extra points given to a house that is architecturally exceptional based on quality?
Well, when you, as I said earlier, when you do an appraisal, you're selecting comparables that are as similar as possible and that would attract the same buyer. So if we're doing a Q1 home, for example, we're trying to find comparables that are Q1 that have sold. They don't sell as often, just because when people build that type of custom dream home, they don't tend to move. But sometimes, you know, sometimes jobs shift and things like that. So we do, in fact, or people downsizing, you know, they might have built a 6,000 square foot Q1 type home, and now they're empty nesters, and they're looking for half that square footage.
Yes.
So it does influence it, certainly. But if the appraiser selects similar comparables, then it should be reflected in the price of those homes.
That makes sense.
What do you think, Hannah?
That and sometimes if, like when you said architecturally, what word did you use? Like exceptional. That could be something where, again, part of your analysis is looking at like a variety of sales. And maybe you have a contemporary home and you try to find another one, and maybe it's older, but you compare it to data from when it sold. So you take out variables like that, or in the same location, to see if that design, if it had any impact on value or not. So again, it comes down to your analysis, and ideally looking for comparable sales. And if they're not recent, then sometimes your analysis might have to be of older homes, because the most recent contemporary super custom Q1 home you can find sold 6 years ago. So then you can see how it compared to similar sales from 6 years ago when it sold, to see if that architectural exceptionalness really added value or not.
That makes sense. Well, I also think it's a subjective thing. You can't really look at that objectively.
If like super custom, like sometimes it is hard to find an exact home like it. Like a lot of times unique homes, like when we get order forms, where it'll be like stop and call if it's a unique home like this, and it'll be like geodesic homes or berm style homes. So we don't typically have to deal with that. I've never, I don't think Ashley has. But yeah, that could be where you're getting into something subjective, like another geodesic home within a 100-mile range. I don't know. So that ideally you find comparable sales to measure that against.
And Hannah used the word unique in her description, and we often do, because unique is a good word. It means something, but that's a no-no on an appraisal. Because lenders don't want to lend on unique. They want vanilla ice cream. They don't want tutti frutti, as I like to say. So you try to use words that are different than that.
So what do people typically think adds value that doesn't? Because there are things that you look at, obviously, and we've had this conversation, so people will know, I think, a bit more what concretely adds value. But what do people typically think, for example, and we had this conversation, last time you guys were here, I like watching Rock the Block. They said built-ins add value. There's a built-in, so it adds value. Does a built-in bookcase add value?
Cumulatively, as I've said, it kind of may get you to like a Q3 instead of a Q4. That's usually the jump that you might make if you start customizing what was kind of an average quality and you start making it good quality. The only thing I would say is, as I've said already, just whatever improvements you're trying to make, keep it within the realm of what is typical for a property like yours. Because you can certainly spend, too much money on doing extras that you may not get a return for. And most often we're showing up too late. We're coming in to do the refinance after they've already done all this work. where we did a home not too long ago where it was in a nice subdivision, new construction, and I think initially it was probably 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, which is about what homes were. Well, they came back and they're like, oh, we need for you to reappraise this. We've added another level to the home. It was 10,000 square feet. And so that's the type of thing where I usually will say to Hannah, I wish these people would have called me ahead of time. Because the appraised value didn't come close to meeting their cost.
Yes.
Because there's a certain cap, if you will, in a market area that homes can be worth, quite honestly. And one of the things is just that the lender wanting everything bracketed. And one of the most important things they want bracketed is your final opinion of value. So in our area for the longest time, I think we might be up to, what's the highest sale we've had, Hannah? So
I think it's 1.56.
1.56 million.
Is the newest
So,
one.
and they're in that 10,000 square foot home, they spend a lot more than that. But you're just kind of constrained by what has been proven by the market that people will pay for a home in Pitt County, North Carolina. And typically those people will be very quick to say, well, just go up to Raleigh and get your comparables. Well, I've never done that just because that's not the same buyer.
Yeah.
And that sort of violates the first rule of what's a comparable to me. So some appraisers may be willing to do that, but we don't do that type of thing. We just keep it like you're supposed to. Like, if the lender were to own this property, how much could they sell it for? And that's proven by what other homes have sold for. We don't have too many 10,000 square foot homes that have been marketed.
No.
But there is a certain, you might spend nearly $3 million on your dream home, but that doesn't mean somebody's going to come along and pay you for that.
Correct.
The very first lesson in appraising is cost does not equal value. And that's a hard thing for people to kind of grasp sometimes because they know they spent $3 million.
Yes.
But the appraiser comes along and it's not worth that much, then they understand we have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
But that's the type of thing I wish somebody would say, hey, is this a good idea? But they never do. So, in answer to your question, I can't think of anything specific to where people put it in and it's just of no value, except maybe excess square footage or something like that. What do you think, Hannah?
The excess square footage, because then you can get into functional obsolescence, where like that additional square footage is not going to give you the same return. Kind of like I think about it like if you bulk buy something, the more you buy, the cheaper it gets.
Yes.
That can happen with square footage too. And if you have, again, for round numbers of 10,000 square foot home in a neighborhood with 2,000 square foot houses, a typical buyer isn't going to pay you that same rate per additional square footage as that square footage increases.
Right.
And so again, it's just diminishing returns. And when you get into something that's not typical, that can also be a factor if you have your 10,000 square foot home buyers are typically in these neighborhoods, but then you've built it in a home with 2,000 square foot houses. They probably go to the neighborhood where it's typical, or they wouldn't pay you the same premium for it there.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, one last deeply practical question for listeners. Last question, unless anybody else has a question. Let's say I have $10,000 and I want to sell my house. Where should I put that $10,000 to get my appraisal value to increase?
That wasn't on the...
I know.
There's some extra credit. Okay, $10,000.
Doesn't have to be 10.
Okay, well that's a good. We like
Yeah.
round numbers. So
Yes.
So as a seller, is that
As
what
a
you're?
seller,
Yeah.
where should I put that money?
Well, I would say just trying to make the home as attractive as possible. I always go back to that adage about appraisers being human beings because we are affected by the property, even though it may not be something that we can actually make an adjustment for.
Yes.
If you walk in and there's not a negative odor to the home and everything's kind of fresh in there, then that's a good thing. So I would say look around, and if you feel like, and you could, if you've got a good friend, they have to be a really good friend, say, ask them, what about my home that you might change, that type of thing. But you're just trying in your mind to think about the typical buyer. What would make the home more attractive to them? Certainly wouldn't be, putting in a built-in outdoor whirlpool or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the type of thing that you probably wouldn't get the return on, like we're talking about with a swimming pool. But so I would say, yeah, just kind of freshening up the surfaces of the home. If you've got any carpeting, typically that gets worn, then you might consider replacing that with a good neutral color. Just things that, and you guys know this working with buyers, things that your buyer wouldn't immediately come in and think, oh, I need to spend some money on that.
Yeah. Let's say I want to sell my house. The thing that you're going to say, oh, the quality on this, or maybe not quality, the condition on this is really good. It's going to improve the effective age of the home. Those things would be like replace the flooring or update old carpet,
interior
paint,
painting, yeah, replace
the
flooring.
surfaces, so like countertops.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, your 10,000 wouldn't go very far if you
No.
get into doing kitchen countertops.
Yes.
But yeah, that would definitely add appeal to the home, and you want to make it so that it compares positively with what else is on the market.
Yes.
Now that we're running into actual some supply, as I mentioned, the new construction where there's 16 active listings.
Yeah.
You got to be aware as a seller, what are these buyers going to be looking at after they leave my home? And for the longest time recently, there hasn't been anything else for them to look at.
Yes.
You guys know that all too well. You're like, hey, I got one to show you. And there's not 3 more you're going to go visit after that. But that's changing, I think, a little bit.
That's it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and you like our show, please subscribe and leave us a review. And make sure to tune in again in 2 weeks' time for another episode of Lived In.